Welcome to All the Best, an interview series with UNL ORCA awardees, where UNL means University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and ORCA is the Outstanding Research and Creativities Award, which is UNL's top award. In Gerda Lerner's book, Why History Matters, she explains the life stories give meaning to the present and the future because we identify what is important to us. And she says, our stories show how we are interconnected in a particular time and place. As for this interview series, ORCA awardees have experiences that reach back more than a half a century, which will give us a personal view of how the best research emerged from UNL. It is my pleasure to introduce today's interviewee, Dr. Ross Thompson. He was awarded the ORCA in 2000. After I provide a quick summary of his life and career, Ross will tell us about his time at UNL, starting with his award-winning research, and then provide some insight about his work at the University of California, Davis. Ross was born in 1954 in Madison, Wisconsin. He traveled nearly 2,000 miles west to earn a bachelor's in psychology, magna cum laude, from Occidental College in Los Angeles. Then he traveled east over 2,200 miles to earn a master's and doctorate in psychology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. In 1981, he joined the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as an assistant professor of psychology and quickly rose through the ranks while studying childhood emotional development. In 2003, 3 years after earning the ORCA, Ross left UNL to join the psychology department at the University of California, Davis. He retired in 2023 and still lives in California. With that, I want to welcome Ross to the interview.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for being interviewed. So let's start out with my favorite first question. What was your impression about the UNL campus when you saw it for the very first time? And what are your thoughts about it now?
Well, UNL reputation had preceded it by the time I actually traveled out to Lincoln. I should say that when the invitation to interview arrived, I was arriving home from a conference. My wife was leaving from one. She had just gotten the message, and as a born and bred Californian, discovered to her dismay that not only was Nebraska in the middle of the map, but Lincoln was right on the crease. But I had enough experience growing up as a Midwesterner to know what to expect. Lincoln UNL looked very much like the kind of campus I had expected. A solid research institution, flagship institution of the state university system. I knew that it was very committed to research in agriculture, which is consistent with the economy of the state, but I also knew that the psychology department was a strong and growing one. And so this felt like a really good place to start my career. And that's why I stayed there for 20 years, because it also turned out that Lincoln is a great place to raise children. And we were delighted to do that. It was only after our oldest son had gone off to Stanford that I got the call along about that time from Davis to invite me to come out to interview and eventually to accept a job there. Now, there's nothing more schlocky as an adolescent to go off to halfway across the country to university and to get away from home only to have the home follow you there. And we promised our son that we would never show up uninvited on his dorm doorstep. By that time, I had very mixed feelings about UNL. It had grown. It had become prominent in some important areas. It had put a stake in the ground, particularly in some areas relating to children's development, as well as water and other important issues. But I had also witnessed a university that was chronically underfunded. I came to conclude by that point that Nebraska had more higher education than it was capable of affording. And it simply gets really wearisome when you're in a position of trying to build a program as well as a lab, to be told year after year to do more with less. And so I was looking for an environment that was both research vigorous, but also funded adequately to the mission. And that's why the invitation from Davis looked attractive at the time.
And there are many similarities between UNL and UC Davis, but I'm sure you know all about that.
Well, yes. I mean, Davis started out as the agricultural extension campus for UC Berkeley, and for a long time, that was really what they were known for.
Mhm.
We're still the Aggies, which is a little bit less interesting, I think, than Huskers. But over this period of time that I was at UNL, Davis was also growing. So much so that when I accepted the invitation there, I had to tell my father, whose daughter, my sister, had gone to school at UC Davis, that this is a lot different UC Davis than the one he remembers from those days. In many respects, it's been fun to watch both campuses grow, but I have also been watching the way in which Davis seems to have made its way through some of the perils of the California economy, and I think that has worked to its advantage.
Awesome. Well, that sounds really good. So let's jump into your award-winning research, especially about the ORCA. Give us a sense about how that came about, what you actually did, and why it's important.
Okay, happy to do so, Mark. I'm a little bit different from some of the other ORCA winners you've interviewed, in the sense that my research is squarely in human behavioral science. Years later, I managed to incorporate some neuroscience into it, but that's another story. And I was also deeply committed to a body of research that was really exploding at that time, focused on parent-infant attachment. Now, these days, we all talk about attachment not only as something that happens in childhood, but something that we experience as adults in our relationships. But this was really the early beginnings of that body of research. And a lot of the fascination was with infants and toddlers because of the idea that the security or insecurity that derives from these early attachments have the potential of shaping not only children's relationships in the years to come, but also shaping personality, social, emotional dispositions. And this is where my work focused on. Also how children thought about themselves and about other people and about how to get along. In a sense, learning the rules of relationships from the security of early attachments. And I was particularly interested in how those thoughts, those cognitions, those understandings of the social and psychological world took shape from early attachment relationships. Discovered a lot of it had to do with the child's own reflections on their experience as a relational partner with a parent. But also we discovered some of it comes from parent-child conversation. It turns out that parents of securely attached, very young children talk to their kids differently than do the parents of insecurely attached kids. And in their simple prosaic conversations about the child's experience or the day's events or what have you, children were distilling really important lessons about emotion, about themselves, about relationships, about how to get along with others. And we thought this is important and still do, not only for understanding the nature of early psychological development, early social emotional understanding, but also has tremendously important implications for early childhood mental health. Now, in those days, the idea that you could use the term mental health and apply it to babies and toddlers was it was not something you ran across very often. But what we were discovering was that because of what is going on in this relationship, a secure or insecure one, is laying the seeds for the child's own emotional well-being. And in more extreme circumstances where you have a parent who's depressed, where you have a child who's being neglected or, God forbid, maltreated, you can begin seeing early mental illness creeping up, as early as the first birthday. And we thought that understanding these relationships unpacking them as we were trying to do, particularly in the context of the warmth and sensitivity, but also the conversations that parents are having with their children, would give us some of the tools we might need for understanding the origins of early mental health problems, but also some of the avenues for treating them. And I'm pleased that from those days in the early 1980s, a lot of that promise has been fulfilled. I can talk about that a little bit later if you wish, but it's been wonderful to see how we are have developed a much richer understanding of the psychological life and well-being of very, very young children.
Great. So you were in the department for, what was it? Yeah, about 20 years, and then you got the ORCA. So
Yes.
Was there a particular reason that somebody wanted to submit you to get an ORCA, or that you applied for an ORCA? I mean, everything you've said here is fantastic, of course.
Well, this is a part of what I was doing at the time. That was the focal point of the research and the work of my lab. I was also doing a lot of work on developmental science and public policy, and it was helpful that we had in our department, and still do, one of the most nationally prominent law psychology programs in the country. This is a program that students come, they get both their law degree and their psychology PhD, and therefore become capable of integrating these fields, whether they're in academics or in private practice. Some of our graduates have gone on to work in jury decision-making processes. And at the time that I came, the program had just been the new director to the program had just arrived, named Gary Melton, who was a specialist in early childhood mental health. And so quite fortuitously, Gary and I worked together a great deal. And from that, I began thinking much, much more richly about the ways in which developmental science can inform major questions in family law. This is actually something I started working on in graduate school, and UNL provided a context for doing so. And so I think the ORCA emerged, I was nominated for it, I suppose, both because of the lab research we were doing, but also because of some of the fairly insightful integrations that we were offering to psycholegal topics, especially in family law. Everything from child abuse prevention to child custody when parents divorce, to grandparent rights, and on down the line. I mean, we were writing in those days about research ethics. We were weighing into the child care controversy and what are children's needs in relation to out-of-home care. At that time, very controversial. And the idea that the science we were doing in the lab had direct relevance in a way that could affect public policy was quite a new and exciting idea. And so I think to some extent, some of the motivation for the ORCA nomination came from that as well.
So yeah, very strong social input. That sounds very likely. Very good. So tell us about one or two of your early graduate students or visiting faculty, and what were their projects and how about their careers?
Well, as I was preparing for this interview, Mark, I realized that some of the best students I've had in my career were ones who came to UNL to work with me in what was at that time a fledgling program in developmental psychology. So the two students I'm going to mention to you are ones that have caused the greatest pride and been some of the best that I've worked with. One is a young woman named Debbie Leibel, who came to UNL pretty much straight out of Brandeis University. And she was one of those who took this set of questions about what is it that children in secure and insecure relationships are learning to think about themselves and the psychological world. She did some work on the differences between secure and insecure kids and their emotion understanding. But what she really did was to unfold some new questions about the relevance of security of attachment to early conscience development, and the idea that the young children who are in the kind of secure relationships from which they derive a sense of confidence and trust, that confidence and trust also motivates their greater cooperation when it comes to their uh, complying with the instructions or the requests of their parents, and acting in a generally helpful way. And so in a couple of detailed studies, one of which turned into her dissertation, we discovered that there's a difference in terms of moral judgment and moral development that seems to be taking place. And again, this is as early as 4 to 5 years old. Debbie went on to a faculty appointment at Southern Methodist University and is now a full professor at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Shortly after Debbie finished her degree, another outstanding student named Abby Rakes came into our lab. Abby had already earned her master's degree from Columbia University, but she wanted to get a PhD in developmental psychology, but with a particular emphasis, which has proven to be a career-long emphasis for her, on children in disadvantaged circumstances. So her major work involved a sample of early Head Start families that she had recruited, all of them recruited from Lincoln, and trying to understand the consequences of poverty and economic insufficiency on the parent-child relationship, mostly mother-child relationships in these days, looking at everything from parenting stress to social support to parent-child conversation as they related to an influence that developing security of attachment as well as a child's emotion understanding. And what she succeeded in doing was replicating some of our earlier work, documenting that even in economically stressed families, children who are in secure relationships do develop more insightful understanding of other people's emotions. But she also documented the ways in which emotional understanding, emotional development was shaped not just by the mother-child relationship, but also by elements of the broader family climate. And through a series of interview queries to the mothers, we found that elements of the troubles experienced by other family members, whether a family member had a substance abuse problem, whether there was a history of incarceration, and other kinds of stresses in the family, had their own direct impact upon the child. And that was something that we had not seen earlier. And so in a sense, we were understanding how a child, even in the early years of life, is being shaped both directly and indirectly by things that are going on, not just in the mother-child relationship, but also in the broader family. Abby after she got her degree, went to work at the Gates Foundation up in Washington, and then spent a couple of years with UNESCO in Paris before returning back to Omaha, where she is currently in the Department of Health Promotion in the College of Public Health at the UNL, or actually University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha, where she is a full professor, and she is also director of the UNMC Center for Global Health and Development. And Abby's just continuing and expanding these themes, particularly looking at early childhood development in low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa and Latin America, and in high-risk populations in the United States, with a particular focus on differences in learning. And that's an appropriate topic, given the concerns we're having about children, especially in low and middle income countries, being able to develop the school relevant skills to enable them to succeed in elementary school. And this is one of the UNL, or not the UN, one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that she is doing research helping to advance.
Wow. That is fantastic students you had there. So the next question is about impact. It's one of my favorite questions, it turns out. Every year we get evaluated as faculty, right? But then we also have this long-term vision of what we want to achieve. And so that is not usually captured very well on this annual impact. But this impact is also folded into how do you evaluate impact? But I'm asking specifically then for psychology, what does the psychology department of UNL, what did it value for impact? And then after this, I'm going to show you some of your citation numbers, and then we'll talk about those specifically.
You know that in our field, we often look at citation count as a measure of impact. Some of my friends and I joke about that with the realization that oftentimes citations can arise from critical evaluation. A person can be, we can think of people actually who have a high citation count, but mostly because their articles are the subject of denigration in print. And that's what nobody wants. I think that what people in the department were sensitive to was the extent to which scholars in our field outside of the department were not only aware of my work, but using it in their own research. Mm-hmm. One of my most cited papers was actually a conceptual piece, not an empirical piece, entitled Emotion Regulation, a Theme in Search of Definition. And it arose because I was aware that more and more people were talking about emotion regulation, especially in its development. But the concept of emotion regulation they were using was very fuzzy. And I both offered a definition as a proposal that many people have cited and used since that time. But I also offered a portrayal of what emotion regulation is. Adopting a functionalist point of view to argue that what emotion regulation is fundamentally meant to do is to help the child accomplish certain emotion goals in specific situations, and to understand how adequate a child's emotion regulation efforts are. It's not a matter of evaluating, how often the child is emotionally flying off the handle or how often the child is emotionally withdrawn, but rather what is the emotional context that the child is regulating in relation to. And I pointed out in the article that a child who's growing up with a depressed parent has very different emotion regulation goals than a child growing up in a family with parents with a more balanced emotional life. And therefore, the child may present very differently as an emotional regulator than the child growing up in a more balanced home will. And running through examples like that made it helpful for people to understand that emotion regulation is something that we have to look at functionally in relation to the child. I think it's those kinds of things that the department responded to. They were also aware of my public policy work and the fact that I was being invited to give distinguished addresses and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So when hiring new faculty in psychology, then they don't have much of a track record, these potential new faculty, and it's harder to pick out who's going to be super successful, just like yourself. But let's look at some of your most highly cited papers. Now, the listeners are not going to be able to see this piece of paper, so I'm going to have to read some of these things. And let's start with some papers published while you were at UNL. And so you said psychology favors papers, but you've also got book chapters. So this one, emotional regulation, a theme in search of a definition, is the one you just mentioned. And 8,700 citations. And it says it's in the monographs of the Society for Research in Child Development. And 8,700 is a huge number. There must be a lot of psychologists out there. Do you think this is mostly citations in other papers or people writing books?
I think both. I think it also appears in many papers. I think that as the field of emotion regulation and its development has emerged, researchers are being more careful about basing their measurement of emotion regulation within a coherent definition.
Mhm.
And I think that's why this particular paper has been useful. It provides a definition I think that many people have found useful over the years.
Mhm.
I actually had a colleague of mine who I had consulted as I wrote this chapter say to me years later, "How does it feel to have written a paper that everybody cites?"
Yeah.
Which I thought was high praise from a colleague who was working in the same field.
Yeah, absolutely. So then another one, which was published in 91, was Emotional Regulation and Emotional Development in Educational Psychology Review. It has 1,461 citations, which is a huge number. What was that one about?
Well, that was really an effort to sort of take these ideas and apply them to the field of education. That's why it was published in Educational Psychology Review. It went through the review process, but the editor had asked me if I would consider writing something like this, because I thought that he thought that it was important that that those working in educational research um, be aware of how a functionalist approach to emotion regulation might be relevant to how to think about children's classroom behavior. To state an example that I've used many times since then, if a child is coming from a home that is that involves recurrent threat to the child, which can be a home that is abusive. It can be a home where there are substance abuse problems. It can be a home where parents are punitive on a chronic basis. That child is going to develop a sense of vigilance to threat. And that's going to shape their emotion regulatory efforts. But when they come to a classroom, it's not as if they can put all that aside. And that's why these are kids who are more likely to be troublesome in the classroom. They're more likely to get in fights with peers. And we look at those kids, and our seat of the pants judgment is they're just not very self-regulated. They're not very emotionally self-controlled. But what is more true is that their emotional self-control has been tailored to a home environment where being vigilant to threat is absolutely necessary to protect yourself. And so we might approach a child like that very differently. And in fact, what has happened in the years since then is educators are now being trained in what is called trauma-informed teaching. And trauma-informed teaching asks not what is wrong with this child, but what has happened to this child to make them this way. It's exactly the kind of approach that I was urging in that 1991 paper.
Beautiful. So you've also written quite a few book chapters, which in many ways are equivalent to journal articles, but a little bit different. And you've got one here from 1999, Early Attachment and Later Development in the Handbook of Attachment, with 2,000 citations, which again is even huge. Tell us about that paper.
Yes, this was the first edition of a handbook that has subsequently gone through, I think, a total of 4 editions at this point, the Handbook of Attachment. It was meant to try to capture in a number of chapters the emerging body of research in the field of childhood attachment, actually of lifespan attachment. The task that I was given was to address what had proven to be a controversial question by this time. Namely, how much does an early attachment foreshadow important elements of how a child is going to turn out in the years to come? And the reason it was a controversial question, and I can talk about this in more detail later, was actually some of my own research when I was a graduate student. We often think about attachment as shaping a child's life course. We talk about ourselves as adults who may be secure or insecure in relationships, and it's very easy to think that this may have arisen from how we were treated as early as our own infancy. But what I found, and I was one of the first people to discover this, is that although that is sometimes true, that children's early attachments endure, remain stable and consistent over time, oftentimes they change. And so they sometimes change in response to changes taking place in the family, for example, that may alter familiar patterns of parent-child interaction. Mm-hmm. And so what does this mean then for how attachment relates to later development? And so I was asked to write this chapter in large measure because some of my work had raised some of the most important questions. And I think the number of citations reflects that people found the balanced discussion, which is what I sought to create, very helpful. By this time, Mark, in 1999, I was becoming regarded as a pretty fair interpreter of the attachment research, not necessarily committed to one point of view or another, and therefore my conclusions about what the research was showing and where it was leading were probably pretty trustworthy. Mm. And I think that's why I was asked to, for each of the subsequent editions of the Handbook of Attachment, to revise and update the same chapter for those new editions. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I'm going to interject here. I am a family historian, and I've done many profiles for people. And your note here about changing dynamics of families is certainly true, right? So an injury of the father, or perhaps an early death of some important family members, completely sometimes changes the family.
Yes, exactly.
Profoundly.
Exactly. And so our seat of the pants assumption that how things begin in secure or insecure relationships is necessarily how things will endure.
Yeah.
Is important to question. It really depends on the context and the subsequent events that happen in the family.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to do one more, unless you want to talk about other ones. But since you've been at Davis, you have a book chapter titled Emotion Regulation, Conceptual Foundations, published in 2007 in the Handbook of Emotion Regulation, which has in it stellar 11,561 citations. So tell me about that one. I have to know.
Well, if you ask somebody in the field of social psychology, who is a leader in the study of emotion regulation, the name James Gross would immediately come to mind, and probably unquestioningly. And at the time that he was putting this Handbook of Emotion Regulation together for the first time, James was really sort of at the top of the game. He still is, as a matter of fact. But he was aware of the work that was going on in the development of emotion regulation. He was looking for someone to help him put this handbook together, who would both help recommend chapter authors for chapters that dealt with the development of emotion regulation, but eventually invited me to write the foundational chapter, the introductory chapter, the one on conceptual foundations. And I remember long conversations with James about this, because at that time, our own ideas about emotion regulation were not entirely on the same page. Oh. After all, he was working from the point of view of the adult literature. I was working on it from the point of view of the developmental literature. Mm-hmm. So when you think, for example, about emotion regulation, how it's influenced by other people, it's a kind of a different process. If you're thinking about a parent who's trying to socialize a child's skills in emotion regulation, versus if you're thinking about another adult trying to soothe or otherwise help an adult kind of remedy and manage their emotions on their own. So we had a lot of time in long conversations about this, and I think that the chapter reflects the fruits of those conversations. And I think that's one of the reasons it's been cited so frequently.
That's amazing, 11,561. So if you're fine, I will go on to the next question.
Sure.
And come on. We've covered some amazing papers, but which of your publications do you remember the most? Which one makes you the happiest?
Oh my. I would really have to think at some length about that, as I suspect is true for you.
Oh, sure.
Different papers bring different satisfactions.
Yeah.
Um, I did a paper on research ethics that just kind of came out of the blue.
Mm.
That was, I thought, a real contribution to the field, and a much needed one that makes me pleased whenever I think about that.
Yeah.
One of the papers that you have on the list that you were working from of frequent citations was called Developmental Science in the Media, Early Brain Development.
Mm.
And this was when the field of early brain development was just exploding in public attention. And I work with a friend of mine who was and is a prominent developmental neurobiologist to talk about the ways in which the media reporting of early brain development was in some respects helpful and in some respects completely misguided. And the reason that gives me satisfaction is the ideas in that paper continued to germinate and eventually resulted in a book that came out of mine that came out 2 years ago called The Brain Development Revolution: Science, the Media, and Public Policy, in which I really look at the unfolding of public understanding of early brain development and talk about how that public understanding was shaped by actors and agencies, some of which were extremely helpful and some of which were completely misleading.
And so that's for the public?
Pardon me?
It was written for the public?
Oh, yes, it was written for the public.
Okay.
In fact, a friend of mine read it and said he was surprised. He was expecting a more academically oriented book. But that was really a labor of love because I had been watching. In fact, I was in some respects involved in the events that led to a big public media campaign about early brain development in April 1997, which eventually led to a National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon Committee report, of which I was a part of, and a number of other things that kind of, the book gave me an opportunity to unfold those processes and influences. And in so doing, also to try to introduce the reader to what do we know about early brain development? Where does that information come from? And to talk also about, how public messages get framed in ways that can cause us to, can lead us to better understanding at times, or can cause us to be misled in some of our conclusions. I think that this brain development revolution that took place created some real wins for kids. It meant that people were talking about early childhood education, pre-kindergarten education in a way that they never did before. But it also led to some real missed opportunities. Even in those days, we knew a heck of a lot about the impact of poverty on brain development. And yet, the brain development revolution did very, very little for improving or expanding programs for children who were the most economically disadvantaged.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about your curatorial activities, books that you've edited, society leadership, that sort of thing.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I begin with books, really. I have, depending on how you count, I have about 8 books that I've either authored or edited.
Okay.
And they do really reflect, Mark, the diversity of interest that we've been talking about. Barely out of graduate school, but 4 years into my time at UNL, we published together, my advisor and several co-authors, including me, a book called Infant-Mother Attachment: The Origins and Developmental Significance of Individual Differences. That was about the time the Nebraska Symposium volume that I had put together on social emotional development was also published. But then in the 1990s, two public policy books came out. One was one that I wrote called Preventing Child Maltreatment Through Social Support, a critical analysis, which was really an effort to, again, take on this question of how much can social support help to prevent children being abused within their families. And I look at the things, good things that social support can do, but also some of the ways that social support might be completely unhelpful, to try to sharpen up what people were expecting from this. And later on, Paul Amato of the sociology department and I edited a volume called The Post-Divorce Family, children, parenting, and society.
Mm-hmm.
That was an edited volume from a conference that we ran at UNL a couple of years earlier, really asking what does the research tell us about how family adaptation to divorce can occur most productively for children, and in what ways can both legal and public policies be adapted to try to promote those kinds of constructive outcomes. Just before I left UNL, Gary Melton and I and Mark Small put together another edited volume called Toward a Child-Centered Neighborhood-Based Child Protection System, in which, again, we were doing some blue sky visioning along with other authors about if we were truly thinking about it, a child protection system being child-centered, would it be different from the way in which it exists now? And would a neighborhood-based system be more effective in actually preventing child abuse? One could go on, but I've already mentioned the most recent book I published called The Brain Development Revolution. That came out a couple of years after another edited volume called Attachment: The Fundamental Questions, in which I and a couple of colleagues basically asked a collection of about 40 leading attachment scholars some of the questions that had been with the field for decades, and asked them basically, what have we learned over this time, over the roughly 50 years of attachment theory and research. It was a fun volume to put together, and the kind that one doesn't see all that often.
No, that sounds really good. Let's see. How was your research funded? And then how did the funding organizations change over time?
Well, Mark, in this respect, I may also differ from some of the other people that you've been interviewing, in the sense that my research was labor intensive, but could also get along on a fairly modest budget.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a couple of grants from the Foundation for Child Development. I had a planning grant from National Science Foundation. There were some National Research Service Award, pre-doctoral fellowships that my students got, including Debbie and Abby. And there were several, of course, internal research grants and aid from UNL. But the bulk of the work that was the basis for my research was involving the direct testing of infants and young children with their parents in our lab, and then always, detailed analyses of what was said and done during those research sessions. And for those, I managed to recruit an enthusiastic cohort of undergraduate research assistants who were simply thrilled to be working with videotaped observations of kids doing interesting things, and to be involved in the scientific process of unpacking what those videotapes were showing. So those grants, as small as they were enough to sustain us during those times. Later on, I was named the Carl Happel Distinguished Professor of Psychology, and with that came an annual research stipend that also supported a lot of our work. That's not to say that the changes that took place in the funding environment, especially at the federal level, weren't influential. And one of the biggest ones was the transition from the National Institute of Mental Health which had been a major funder of research in my field when my career began. And that, with the changing priorities of that agency, really was eclipsed and replaced by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which, along with NSF, continues to be the major source of federal research funding for developmental research.
Wow. So you've gone over some of the techniques that you used, but could you just give us a sense of interviews with parents, and then what are the things you used to get this information?
Well, one of the things that made attachment research take off in the way that it did was the use of a highly standardized procedure that nevertheless, or that because it was highly standardized, really reliably could give us insights into the security of a parent-infant or parent-child relationship. And the procedure is called, strangely enough, the strange situation, a kind of a euphemistic title that really captures probably what the experience is for most babies in it, because it takes place in a research playroom like the one that I had at UNL. It involves then a subsequent series of 7 episodes, each of them about 3 minutes apiece, involving the entrance of a stranger who interacts with the child while they're playing with toys, the departure of the parent for a separation episode in the company of the stranger, and then the return of the parent, and then finally the separation by the parent of the child when the child is left all alone, followed by a reunion. The purpose of the procedure was not to gauge how upset kids got by separations. Most of them didn't like it. We used to call that separation episode the "oh shit" episode, because you could tell that's exactly how kids were reacting.
What am I going to do now?
What am I going to do now? I'm in a strange environment. Yes, there are nice toys. Yes, there's this nice lady who's playing with me, but still, now I'm by myself. But really, the insights come when the parent, usually the mother, returns to the room after a distressing separation. Because although many babies, immediately approach the mother and, clamber up with that raised arms gesture and wanting to be held, many babies do not. Some watch the mother come in the room and basically ignore her, act as though she, that her return doesn't make any difference. They seem unusually self-reliant. Other babies clamor and want to get up, and as soon as they're up, they don't settle down. They push away and want to get down again. And what the research, what literally thousands of studies have shown, is that these behavioral differences, these reunion differences, not the separations, reliably tell us about the security, trust, and confidence that inheres in that relationship for a young child. So we set up our lab to have the ability to do that. We also had mothers report on their child's behavior. That was another convergent way of looking at their security. We also set up situations when children got a little older, 3, 4, 5 years of age, in which we'd ask mother to talk with their child about a recent event that we cued her on. For example, we asked mother to talk about a recent event in which the child had misbehaved and what had happened. And from those conversations, or for that matter, a recent event in which the child had helped somebody. And from those, we try to unpack what it is that mothers are saying to represent other people's internal experience, because we think this is where children were learning a lot about what people are like and how to interact with them. We did this actually somewhat earlier, before kids were really conversational partners, by putting together wordless storybooks with just the pictures in them, and then asking the mother to show these storybooks to their infant or toddler children. And in this case, we're asking, what does a mother create out of a picture that may tell us something about how she communicates emotion and about people's internal states to her child. So by using procedures like these, we were trying to gain insight into what is the ordinary fabric of mother-child interaction. Might it be providing the child with insights about the psychological world that they together inhabit? And how does this relate to secure and insecure attachment?
All right, that sounds awesome. My next question is about other researchers in this area. So research is cooperative and competitive. And was your field, your work ever co-opted by someone, or did someone publish at the same time?
Well, developmental psychologists, maybe psychologists in general, tend to work hard to be as cooperative and collegial as possible. But I have to say that when I came to UNL, I had already gotten off on a wrong foot, and it was something that really lasted for much of my career. We talked earlier about the way in which intuitively we believe that early security or insecurity tends to endure, that we are adults. As adults, we are secure or insecure in our relationships in large measure because of what we experienced in early childhood. And my dissertation finding was really the first to challenge that point of view seriously with data, and to show that roughly half the kids in our sample changed in the security of attachment over the course of a 9-month period, or rather a 7-month period. And those changes were associated with changes going on in the family. A mother who goes back to work, a child who goes into childcare. And so we couldn't assume that the security of attachment remained, and therefore we couldn't assume that an early security or insecure relationship was going to necessarily have long-term far-reaching influences on personality, on social disposition, on the whole raft of outcomes that researchers had started documenting in those days. Well, the proverbial stuff hits the fan at that point. I have a leading researcher in the field who claimed in print that the only reason that I got the results that I did was because I wasn't using the strange situation properly. I remember when I got a pre-publication copy of that paper, and I had to go out for a run just to calm myself down. But together with my co-authors, I was the lead author on a reply where he basically showed that it wasn't such a well-established finding that early attachments endured unchanged. And in fact, it was an open question. And then I provided evidence that we knew exactly what we were doing. I think that exchange, which is very, very rare for it to occur in print in our field, really got the attention of the field, and certainly made my name a recognizable name by the time I got to UNL. Not something that I particularly wanted. I mean, I felt very much like a friend of mine who said, I just want to be part of the control group of life. But there it was. And some of my early career, and one of the reasons you see so many book chapters, is, as I mentioned earlier, I did develop the reputation of being a pretty fair interpreter of the research. And as a result, more and more editors, more and more foundation officials were coming to me asking me to summarize the attachment research, to tell them what the state of the field was. And so it turned out to be a career bootstrap. But I got to tell you, it lasted a long time. I was being introduced for a keynote address at a university that was where some of the researchers were most angry at me, and I think one of those researchers who happened to be at the conference commented from the stage that in those days I wasn't looked at as a colleague, I was looked at as an enemy. And this is 30 years later.
Wow.
So that was That was not how I expected to start my career, but it does reflect the fact that sometimes careers take directions that they do, not for reasons that you can foresee. And interestingly enough, those findings that I published were not what I expected, and that really made a difference.
Awesome. So let's move on to other career activities, such as societies. And which conferences did you attend regularly? Was there a meeting or two that were especially memorable?
Yes. Well, for people in developmental science, the major professional society is the Society for Research in Child Development, an organization that goes back, 70 years maybe, and has conferences on a biannual basis. So there's plenty of time to generate the research that you'll be presenting at symposia and in poster sessions, and a whole lot of pleasure and benefit from meeting with colleagues from all around the world. So the Society for Research in Child Development meetings were my regular cup of tea, and I was just going through the files from for each of those conferences, at least as long as I've retained them, and was enjoying seeing the student papers and the symposium presentations and so forth that were going on. For me, however, I think that what was most memorable was not anything that happened at any of those society meetings, but so much of the other things that were going on at the same time during those years that I was at UNL. For example, there was a put together by my colleague Gary Melton. There was an occasional luncheon that was staged in the House of Representatives in the Capitol building, that was for congressional staffers, the lawmakers themselves were invited, of course, but some of them came, on various topics relating to pending federal legislation. And I found particularly exciting, for example, to be talking about child abuse prevention when there was the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Reauthorization Act being considered right then, and to be cornered by staffers afterwards asking for advice about how they should try to incorporate the research that I just reported into the markup of the bill. That was pretty exciting. There were talks to a variety of audiences. The Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I think those things were memorable in part because of the far-reaching audience that seemed to be very interested in the kind of work that I was doing, and that made it a very exciting time. I suppose, as well, colleagues in the department were impressed as well as annoyed at the frequency with which I was in town to go because I was going to these things.
All right. Did you take a sabbatical? And then if you did, what did you do? Did it ever change your direction?
Yeah. Well, my first sabbatical was one that I planned out very carefully. And partly because it was the first, I treated it as a golden resource, which it was. At this point, my research was well established. But what I wanted to do was to develop my knowledge of family law, because I was increasingly writing on topics in family law. And I wanted to understand not just the policies, but also the procedures, because legal procedure can have as much to do with the outcomes that affect children as the actual policy itself. For example, if there are in the legislation that governs parental divorce and custody strong incentives for parents to negotiate their own solutions to how their children and where their children should live after divorce, it's more likely that parents are going to work hard to compromise and come up with a solution that works in their child's interest rather than asking a judge to make a decision. And so I wanted to understand that much better. Consequently, I got a NIMH postdoc at Stanford University, where I had joint appointments in the College of Law and also the Department of Psychology. I ended up taking law courses, including a course in family law and another on children and the law, taught by Michael Wald, who was a notable scholar in this field at the time. I also taught a course in the psychology department, and it was exactly the kind of sabbatical that I was looking for. I came back with much greater knowledge, so much so that the law college asked me to teach their students a course on children and the law, which I then did for another couple of years.
Awesome. What service contributions do you remember the most? So as faculty, we do service to the department, the university, the community, nationally. So again, this is what do you remember most?
Well, I was fortunate to be part of a department that did not believe in saddling junior faculty with the most onerous service requirements. So I was safe. My time was guarded, and I have always been grateful to them for that. In fact, it was guarded so well that at one point another junior faculty member asked, what was my secret that I never seemed to get committee assignments. But as time went on, of course, and as my own prominence grew, the ORCA Award being some part of that, I began being invited to do more university-wide things and opportunities of greater visibility. Probably the most memorable one is the Future Nebraska Task Force, which Chancellor James Measer had put together. It met from 1998 to 2000. And it was sometimes called the 2020 report because it was meant to envision what the university would look like 20 years from then, and the steps that can be taken to get it there. And although in these days now, it's become almost de rigueur that a new incoming chancellor or president create a blue sky task force to do long-term visioning. And this was something that really was happening for the first time at UNL. And I think there was a lot of excitement about it. There was a lot of hope. And so we took the job very seriously. And that report was released in 2000. Measer actually left along about that time. And so the report had the very strong risk of being a dead duck, except that it had gotten so much media publicity that it was really hard for the incoming administration to completely ignore it. And as I recall, the Omaha World Herald, which had published a number of articles about the report when it was released, published at least one feature story 20 years later asking, so how much has that potential been fulfilled? So Measer left, and I was asked to be part of the selection committee for the next chancellor at UNL, the one that led to Harvey Perlman's appointment. And that was a pleasure in part because I think everybody both saw Harvey as the person who was right for the job at the time, and there's a lot of satisfaction about what he might bring in. I was also doing some things for the field as a whole. I mentioned earlier the National Research Council Institute of Medicine study section, sometimes called a Blue Ribbon Committee, that released a report entitled From Neurons to Neighborhoods, Integrating the Science of Early Childhood Development. This came, interestingly enough, out of public attention and interest in the early brain development research that just a few years earlier had exploded in public attention, and the desire of the feds to present a readable, coherent accounting of not just the developmental neuroscience, but also what a lot of the research in behavioral development told us about the importance of the early years. And that volume turned out to have a lot of impact. At about the same time, a private group is formed called the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. And it was, in some respects, organized to continue what the Neurons to Neighborhoods report had started, namely to put readable, digestible, relevant, implementable information in public hands that was the best distillation of current developmental science. And for someone like me who'd been thinking for a long time about the public communication of science, it was a wonderful group to be affiliated with, as I was for a while. And then finally, I think the other thing I bring up, Mark, just because it was important to me at the time, and still is, was my appointment to the Academy of Distinguished Teachers in 1997. This baker's dozen of people who were given a lifetime appointment, interestingly enough, on a group that was meant to be kind of a general advisory group to the chancellor, but also the provost, about teaching issues, but ended up also functioning in sort of a curmudgeonly role when we felt that teaching was not being given due enough attention and was being eclipsed. So those are some of the bigger service contributions.
All right. Well, that last one's a good segue to the next question. What courses did you teach more often than others? And then what are your thoughts about teaching those courses?
Well, I love teaching. In fact, when I retired a few years ago, I told people, I predicted rather, which has turned out to be true, that the thing that I would most miss in retirement would be the students. And part of it is that having gone to a small liberal arts college, as you mentioned, I went to Occidental College. Some of my reason for going into the academic world was to be a professor, as my father had been as I was growing up. He was a professor of history, and I could imagine a happy career being able to try to create the kind of inspiration in the minds of my students that some of my professors at Occidental had done for me. So I taught the usual suite of beginning and advanced undergraduate courses in developmental psychology. I taught the graduate seminar in developmental psychology, but I also taught introduction of psychology, and I taught it to enormous classes. I filled Love Library Auditorium, such as it existed in those days, with 250 students in back-to-back sections on Tuesday and Thursday. Just wound it up and did it a second time, and loved it, and was pretty good at it. Students seemed to respond well, and indeed they the visibility of having somebody who was being honored for research contributions, teaching students their very first psychology class, also drew some appreciative attention. And partly because students asked to TA for me in order to develop some of those skills, I proposed to the department and they accepted that I then that I would teach a teaching methods in psychology class that would enable me to combine talking with them about, how to think about what you are doing in a classroom, but then have them do some guest lecturing in some of the sections of my Psych 181 classes, so that they could actually get some seat of the pants experience, and then do something that nobody was doing much at that point, which is I did a teaching observation of them. That is, I sat with them afterwards and talked with them about what I saw, the strengths, but also some of the things they could improve on, and asked them to do teaching observations of me. There was a real culture of teaching in the department that I very, very much valued and have missed since leaving. So that was kind of most of my teaching. I also taught a raft of graduate seminars, but those are mostly for graduate students.
So the 2 back-to-back intro to psych courses, did that cover all the students enrolled in, let's say, the fall, or was that half of them, or?
Oh no, Mark. No, one of the blessings and curses of being in a psychology department at a major university is that you have never to worry about having enough students. You've got more student demand than mostly you can know what to do with. And no, in fact, and this was literally, before our time. Um, there was a self-paced instruction, a self-paced remote introduction to psychology class. It was going on at the same time, where students would study the textbook and ancillary materials on their own and come in and take exams every so often. This is well before the days of online instruction, but was essentially trying to create the same thing and to provide this course to more and more students, independent of what I was doing.
No, awesome. So let's move on to your youth. We know you were born in Madison, Wisconsin. Your father was a history professor. So what was it like to grow up? What was your childhood like?
By the way, I gave a valedictory address at the time of my retirement at Davis, and I started off with a picture of a necktie because I wore there, as I did at UNL, a tie loosened at the collar. One of the very few faculty who dressed up in that way. And I said, now I need to answer the question of why. Why have I worn a tie all this time? And I said, there are two reasons. One is that when I walked up to the podium, the first time I gave a lecture, this was at UNL, I overheard one of the undergraduates saying, "Oh shit, a graduate student we've got." And I thought, from that day forth, I thought I would wear the one article of clothing no graduate student would ever wear. But the other reason, and this relates to the question of my growing up, the other reason is that I watched my father go off to school. In those days, dressed not only in a tie, but also a tweed jacket or a corduroy jacket with those leather patches, you may remember. So I didn't do the corduroy jacket, although I do have one. I just did the loosened tie. So what was it like to grow up? It was a mixed experience because my parents divorced when I was 12. And that was why we came out to California. So I introduced myself as bicultural for both the Midwest and the West Coast. And in fact, when I did that sabbatical at Stanford, I was essentially coming home because I had gone to high school with sons and daughters of Stanford faculty members. I knew that campus very well and was happy to spend a year there while studying at the law school. But that was also not a happy time, in part because I think my mother had never expected to be a single parent. She never remarried. And I think she was just thrown for a loop for such a long time about what life had faced her with. So, psychologists often joke with each other that it is never an accident why we choose the research topics we do. And I don't think it's an accident that questions of early security or insecurity have loomed large in my own research.
All right. Well, that goes to my next question, which was, how did you develop an interest in your area? So we know. Yeah,
I think you did. Well, and also having a father who was an historian.
Right.
And history is basically human stories.
Yeah.
And I think that is what led me in that direction. Not the physical or natural sciences. I was good at math, but I hated it. It was understanding human behavior.
All right. So tell us about Occidental and what degree did you earn, and did you do undergraduate research?
Occidental is a small liberal arts college. It was numbered about 1,600 students in those days. I started out as a political science major because I thought I'd go to law school. It turns out I did go to law school, but as a psychologist. And I really was converted to psychology at the beginning of my sophomore year. In those days, and this was during the heyday of the anti-war movement, there was really exciting work going on that kind of was inspiring to somebody who could imagine how much more understanding one can derive of human behavior from this field. And I happen to have some very gifted instructors. So I went straight to graduate school after Occidental. I didn't take time off. I might have wisely done so. In fact, I suggested that to my own older son when he announced that he wanted to go on in psychology. And I suggested to him that he take a year or two off to do something good for himself and for the world. And it turned out to have been miraculous for him and redirected him in some very fruitful ways. I did not do that, but I went straight to graduate school. And part of the reason that was perhaps ill-advised, although it worked out for me, was that I did research as an undergraduate, but it was all my own research. I did a senior honors thesis. There weren't as many big labs in which undergraduates could get involved and therefore develop a sense of what a lab is like and what science is like. I was really putting all that together when I was beginning graduate school. That was a little bit of a challenge for a while. I was sustained by how interesting I was finding the material, and by the fact that eventually this was a pathway that was going to lead me to teaching my own classes. But I had to work very hard to develop a sense as to how you do science well and what are the skills of that.
How did you choose Michigan?
I chose Michigan because the person whose work I most admired in the reading that I had done for my senior honors thesis was Martin Hoffman, who was at Michigan. He had done a lot of work on empathy and pro-social behavior. And I thought there could be nothing better than to study with him. And I did. I really enjoyed that for about a year, did my first year project. And then at the end of that year, or at the beginning of my second year, I think it was, another graduate student comes into my office and says, well, what are you going to do now? And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, now that Marty's leaving for New York University. Well, I have not heard anything about it. And obviously, I did not loom large enough in his landscape for him to even tell me, much less to invite me to come out and join him. So in my second year, I was literally on my own. He'd already left. And I wandered. I floundered, rather. Until at the end of that year, a young assistant professor, indeed my age he was, named Michael Lamb, came to interview in the department, and we quickly hit it up very, very well together. Now, it's a very strange thing to have your advisor be your own age, but he was so productive and so ambitious and so forward-moving that didn't feel like an awkwardness. And he stayed until the end of my fourth year when I was really midway through my dissertation. And then he too left for the University of Utah. And I finished up my fifth year and all the job interviews by myself. Now, I have presented talks to our graduate students about, things you should know in graduate school. And I've usually begun by saying, there is no fate that can befall you that is worse than mine. I've been abandoned by not one but two advisors in graduate school. Nothing can happen to you that is worse than that. And somehow I survived.
No, it sounds like a great disaster story. All right, tell us about your first publication. How many authors were on it? And then who taught you how to write?
Well, Marty didn't have a lab. He didn't have a lab group. One student at the middle of my first year said, you realize, don't you, that Marty only publishes research that is the student's own studies? And that turned out to be true. So my first paper was a little paper on empathy and guilt in young children. And I had done all the work, and it was a Thompson and Hoffman paper. And that was, it really wasn't until Lamb came and set up a lab that I began to get a sense as to how you do that. And that was an intensive and a fruitful experience, but it was cramming a lot into a very short period of time. And indeed, I think it would be fair to say that I was still learning how to do research at the time that I came to UNL. I was fortunate that the research procedures I knew well. I knew how to to run the kind of video equipment that was still a relatively new research technology in those days, and to analyze it. And I just had lots of questions that I wanted to answer, and figured I would figure out how to do good science, because I really was committed to answering those questions. But I guess what you could conclude is that there was a lot of self-teaching going on.
Mm-hmm. Is it more common now to have a postdoc in psychology?
It certainly is, and I did not. I went straight from Michigan. I mean, there is a sense of a man in a hurry when one looks at my career trajectory. But I was offered a postdoc at the University of Denver. At that point, I was thinking that a couple of things would pop on the job market. And so I remember the phone call when the postdoc was being offered to me. As I mentioned, this was the University of Denver. And the person said, well, after we talked about common research interests, he said, now, what do you like to do in your free time? Well, I had been working so hard in graduate school that I really didn't have free time to spend. But I'm trying to manufacture an answer, and I say, oh, skiing. I love skiing. I never skied in my life. But fortunately, I didn't have to make good on that. I came back to UNL. I should mention that, I do look back on those graduate school years and think, how in the world did I survive that? And sometimes my wife was wondering that at the time. I mean, some of it was just, I was working very hard, but I realized, Mark, as I was getting ready for this interview, that a lot of the seeds for themes of my research that would be career long were set in those days. That's where I began the attachment research. I haven't mentioned the fact that I was meeting for a year and a half with a University of Michigan law school professor named David Chambers, who'd come by our lab and wondered whether the strange situation might be a good courtroom procedure to use for deciding how to make sure that custody of a child is awarded to the divorcing parent to whom the child is most securely attached. A good question, but one that led us in more fruitful directions. He wrote a law review article based on our conversation. I wrote a couple of other chapters on that. And on top of all that, I mentioned my early childhood mental health interests that come from attachment research. I was invited to work as a research assistant in what was at that time nationally one of the pioneering early childhood mental health research groups. It was called, non-descriptively enough, the Child Development Project. But it was really the first time anybody had thought not only to conceptualize what early mental health might look like in a baby who is, for example, non-organic failure to thrive for no organic reason, for no physical reason, but because of a disturbance in the parent-child relationship, the mother-child relationship. The child is not keeping food down while they're feeding, in part because the mother is so anxious. And then the question is, how do we conceptualize treatment methods that can, sidestep the traditional therapeutic office and find ways of reaching distressed young parents where they are. And so a lot of therapy took place in kitchens and in living rooms, as well as at the project. Well, they were needing a research assistant as this thing had been going on for a few years to begin doing the evaluations that the federal funding agencies were asking for to determine the efficacy of these therapeutic efforts. And that got me working with videotape materials, working with transcripts of therapeutic encounters that were dictated by the operating therapist. And in the context of doing so, learning a heck of a lot about this new field of early childhood mental health and how it connected with attachment theory. And so that was the germinating seed that eventually led to my affiliating with an organization called 0 to 3, which is the name implies. It's a national nonprofit devoted to the healthy development of kids in the first 3 years of life, first 5 years of life, really, and their parents, especially those who are in economic or other kinds of difficulty. And, I eventually served many years on the board of directors, 15, I think. Eventually became president of the board because this carried on the legacy of that child development project. And now I think we have a much better sense of what early childhood mental health looks like and what are some of the research foundations that are giving us a solid foundation for how we intervene in cases like that. All that was in graduate school, as perhaps because I'm being abandoned right and left by advisors.
All right. Well, that sounds awesome. Let's go to the personal here. We have learned that you have a wife that you probably married in California and that you got a son. Tell us about how they all fit into this narrative of moving around.
Sure, and they do. They do. So I met Janet at Occidental College. She was
Okay.
working on her teaching credential. She was becoming bilingual because at that time in California, there was a premium on hiring bilingual educators. And that's what she was planning on doing until she met me. And then I went off to graduate school. We kept in touch. We became engaged after a year, and we got married after 2 years. But by this time now, she's planning on coming out and joining me in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Not a large need for bilingual elementary educators there. And so Janet, bless her heart, quickly pivoted, got a master's degree in early childhood, and worked for an absolutely outstanding university-based preschool center called Pound House Children's Center that really gave her all the practical experience to complement what her degree was telling her. And by the time we came to Lincoln, after a couple of false starts, Janet was really had become one of the lead teachers of a local childcare program, developing connections with others there, but also beginning to be the gifted early childhood person who added some practical knowledge to all of my research and theoretical knowledge. And I have often said that I have been blessed to have a gifted early childhood educator married to me all this time to be telling me, as she used to put it, what kids are really like. Both of our sons were born in Lincoln, and indeed we stayed there as long as we did, in part because it was a great place for them to grow up. Scott, as I mentioned earlier, went to Stanford. He eventually became a Rhodes Scholar and then worked for the District of Columbia Public Schools during the heyday of school reform. And he is now here in California in San Leandro, working as an administrator in the Department of Social Service. In the Department of Social Services for Contra Costa County, having directed the Head Start and Early Head Start programs through the difficult last few years. His younger brother, Brian, was in high school when he came out here. He went to St. Olaf College in Minnesota and continues to live in Minneapolis with his wife and our grandson.
Wow.
We have two grandchildren, two granddaughters also that are in the San Leandro part of the family.
So before retirement and now after, what did you do for relaxation and entertainment besides work?
Well, that's right. I'd be interested in knowing what kind of answers you get to this question, Mark, because some of us who achieve like this overachieve.
Right.
And I think if I have one regret from my academic days, it's perhaps taking it all a little bit more seriously than necessary. In any case, I loved being an involved father, soccer coach, and all those kinds of things. I was involved in our local church. I did the Lincoln Marathon one year, wanted to do a marathon before I died, thought it might kill me. And together with Janet, we go to concerts. We very much enjoy the theater, and travel out to visit family and relatives as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ross, for talking to me today. I enjoyed hearing all of your stories.
Well, I hope they're as interesting to you and to your listeners as they are to me. It has been a remarkable career, and the ORCA was a remarkable honor. One of the good things that any organization, but especially institutions of higher education, can do well is to recognize those who are achieving where they are. And I certainly felt that from UNL.
The ORCA is very hard to get, and you are clearly deserving. So
Uh,
congrats again.
Thank you very much.